All right, diving in today, and we've got a thinker who I think you'll find especially interesting, Karl Jaspers. Now, he started as a psychiatrist, but became a really influential philosopher in 20th century Germany.
Yeah, he really made his mark, across the board, really. Epistemology, philosophy of religion, even political theory.
And I think for our listeners, especially those of you who are, really into philosophy, you're going to find this deep dive particularly engaging because, Jaspers really tackles these fundamental philosophical questions. I mean, the really big ones.
Oh, absolutely, the ones that have been around for centuries.
Yeah.
But he always seems to come at them from these unique angles that offer a fresh perspective.
Yeah,
It's pretty refreshing, actually.
totally. And the main source we're using to guide our exploration today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Karl Jaspers. It's a pretty comprehensive look at his life and thought, really thorough.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And I think our goal here, our kind of mission for this deep dive, is to pull out those core philosophical contributions that Jaspers makes, the ideas that I think will really resonate with the philosophical mind.
Exactly. And I think it'll be really interesting to also kind of think about why, even though he was so influential, he's not, always at the forefront of philosophical discussions these days.
Right, why he's been, maybe a little bit neglected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, all right, let's start with his background. I mean, starting out as a psychiatrist, that's pretty unusual for a philosopher. How did that early experience shape his later philosophical work?
Well, it's crucial to understanding Jaspers. He was dealing with subjective experience all day long, with people in psychological distress. And that really informed his approach to philosophy. He was really focused on understanding the inner world of individuals, their perceptions, their struggles. And that focus on lived experience is a huge part of his philosophy.
And he even published a major work in that period, right? General Psychopathology in 1913. What were the key takeaways from that book?
Oh, the big deal.
Yeah.
Way ahead of its time. Even as a work of psychiatry, it showed his humanistic and social science leanings, how those were merging with psychopathology. And he was big on observation, really questioning assumptions and really analyzing everything. And get this, he actually went back and revised the book later to incorporate his more mature existential philosophy. So you can already see these early seeds of his later philosophical ideas in his work as a psychiatrist.
Fascinating. So we've got this mind deeply immersed in complexities of the human psyche, and then he transitions to philosophy in the early 1920s. What drove that shift?
For Jaspers, philosophy was not just some abstract intellectual exercise. He believed that engaging with philosophy was how you could truly understand and actualize your own being as a thinker. It wasn't just about the world out there. It was about a deep dive into yourself, a process of self-discovery and self-realization. That was the driving force behind his move from, describing mental states to exploring the nature of existence.
Now, every philosopher is, of course, influenced by those who came before. Who are the key figures that shaped Jasper's thought?
There are a few, but Immanuel Kant is probably the most important one. I mean, there's even a famous line that calls Jaspers the first and the last Kantian.
Wow, that's a strong statement. What's the connection there?
Well, it's about how Jaspers took Kant's transcendental philosophy and made it much more about subjective experience. He put a huge emphasis on spontaneous freedom, the idea that we aren't just determined by external forces. And he saw Kant's ideas as being rooted in our individual experience, not just these abstract categories. Although the Stanford entry does point out that this view of Jaspers as primarily a Kantian is being challenged by some scholars these days.
So Kant was huge. Who else?
Max Weber and his circle were pretty influential, especially during Jaspers' time in Heidelberg. Weber was this sociologist, a big thinker. Jaspers got into some of his ideas on what they called heroic liberalism, a certain type of nationalism, and even ideas on democracy. And it was also a time when people were really grappling with neo-Kantianism, so that definitely had an impact on him.
And then we have his relationship with Martin Heidegger, which was, let's just say, complicated. I mean, they're often seen as pioneers of existentialism, but they also had major disagreements.
Yeah, early on, they were definitely on similar paths, both kind of pushing against Kantian formalism, emphasizing lived experience, this passionate approach to philosophy, kind of like Kierkegaard. But, their differences were deep, and they had a pretty painful break, mostly because of Heidegger's support of the Nazis. And it's interesting, Heidegger actually wrote a critique of Jaspers' psychology of worldviews, saying that Jaspers was still stuck in this subjective metaphysics. And Jaspers, of course, really disagreed with Heidegger's ontology and his politics.
A philosophical bond broken by some fundamental differences, both in their thinking and in how they saw the world. Now, the entry also mentions Kierkegaard and Nietzsche.
Right. Kierkegaard's influence is clear in how Jaspers saw philosophy as this very personal and passionate thing, something that really involved your whole being, you know?
Hmm.
He liked Kierkegaard's focus on authenticity, on really committing yourself to your beliefs. And Nietzsche, you can see his influence in how Jaspers approached philosophical claims, seeing them as like expressions of psychological states, not just objective truths. He also shared Nietzsche's skepticism of, absolute claims to knowledge, any kind of rigid rationality. But Jaspers wasn't all in on Nietzsche. For example, he really pushed back against Nietzsche's naturalistic vitalism, putting more emphasis on transcendence, kind of like Kierkegaard on that point.
And there's a mention of Schelling, too, which might be a less obvious influence.
Yeah, Schelling is an interesting one. So while Jaspers wasn't a fan of some of Schelling's more mystical ideas, he was really drawn to Schelling's concept of what he called a non-identitarian model of cognitive life. Basically, it means that knowledge isn't just the subject mirroring the object. It's something more dynamic, maybe a process of interpretation, or even a kind of revelation that happens at the limits of our rational understanding. And that really connects with Jasper's later idea of ciphers of transcendence, which we'll get into.
Okay, so a pretty rich tapestry of intellectual influences. Let's dig into some of Jasper's key concepts now. The subject-object split seems pretty central.
Absolutely. He saw that division, us as subjects encountering an objective world out there, as the fundamental reality of our mental lives. And it really forms the basis for his whole typology of worldviews in psychology of worldviews.
And these worldviews, Weltanschauung, what were they all about?
He saw them as like these moments where the subject and the object were always bumping up against each other. And importantly, he believed these worldviews could become pathological. They could turn into these rigid, objectivized cages, trapping us and stopping us from experiencing the fullness of human possibility. And for Jaspers, coming from his background, psychological intervention should try to help people move beyond those limited views.
That definitely connects back to his psychiatry roots. Then we've got these ideas of limits and limit situations. What are those all about?
Okay, so limits for Jaspers, they're both the patterns in our thinking, the frameworks we use to make sense of things, and the moments when we realize those frameworks are holding us back. And then limit situations are these big, intense experiences, often involving, dread or anxiety, where we really slam into those limitations head on. And those moments when we face our boundaries, they can be the catalyst for a whole new level of self-awareness. It's interesting, so much of philosophy tries to build these huge systems of knowledge. But Jaspers kind of turns that on its head. He says, maybe understanding really starts when those systems break down. It's a real challenge to the whole idea of searching for absolute certainty.
So facing our limits can actually help us grow. That's a pretty powerful idea. And what about the unconditioned? That sounds like a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, the unconditioned. It's kind of inspired by Kant's idea of synthetic regress, this idea that reason is always reaching for something beyond itself. The unconditioned is the driving force within reason itself, the thing that pushes us to go beyond our current limitations, to keep seeking greater knowledge. It's that restlessness in reason, the engine of philosophical inquiry, the constant questioning. That's the unconditioned at work.
That really captures the spirit of philosophical exploration. And then we've got existential communication. How did Jaspers understand that?
It's how our freedom to transcend those limits is actually achieved. And it happens through real, engaged dialogue with other people, like deep dialogue where we try to set aside our biases and assumptions. It's through those conversations, that real back and forth, that we can broaden our understanding and move beyond our own individual limits. He really contrasts this with Kierkegaard's focus on this inner, often solitary journey of self-discovery. For Jaspers, it takes engagement to really break free.
Truth is not just a solo mission, then. It's something we find together. Now, there's this idea of the encompassing from his later work of truth. What's that all about?
The encompassing is a more complex concept that kind of builds on those ideas of the subject-object split in worldviews. It's a way of understanding the different levels of both thought and being, almost like a hierarchy. Think of it like Jaspers trying to bridge phenomenology and ontology, creating a way of understanding being that incorporates different modes of awareness, kind of like Hegel, but with a stronger focus on individual experience. It's how everything, reality, and our experience of it is contained within this bigger framework, this encompassing thing that goes beyond any one subject or object.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. And he also reinterprets Kant's transcendental ideas as ideas of transcendence. What's the difference there?
Yeah, good catch. So for Kant, Those transcendental ideas, like the unity of the world, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God, they were mostly regulative. They helped guide our thinking, but they didn't give us actual knowledge. But Jaspers, he turns them into ideas of transcendence, seeing them not just as the limits of what we can know, but as real realms of lived knowledge. We move through those ideas, and by experiencing the tension within them, we realize that we are fundamentally transcendent beings. It's like those ideas aren't just boundaries, they're launching pads for reason to go beyond its limits.
So, a pretty significant shift from Kant's view, and then there's the concept of ciphers of transcendence. What are those?
So, Jaspers agreed with Kant that we can't really know transcendence directly through reason. But, he said, we can experience it through these ciphers. They're like these hints or symbols we find in the world, in nature, art, religious experiences, even philosophy itself. Like, imagine that feeling of awe you get looking at a starry sky. For Jaspers, that feeling, that sense of something vast and mysterious, could be a cipher. It doesn't prove transcendence, but it points to it. It makes you think. They're like glimpses of something beyond. But we never get the full picture.
We get hints, not the whole answer. And this leads to the idea of foundering, or Scheitern.
Exactly. Foundering is that moment when we really hit our limits and realize that our understanding just isn't enough to grasp ultimate reality. It's that experience of realizing just how limited we are. And ironically, it's in that failure, in that recognition of our limits, that the experience of transcendence can kind of sneak in.
It's like a negative metaphysics, as the entry puts it.
It's exactly right. Jasper's metaphysics isn't about defining things in a positive way. It's about understanding our existence in relation to the fact that we can't have this complete positive knowledge of metaphysics. It's driven by our desire for transcendence, even though that desire can never be totally satisfied.
And finally, there's the concept of philosophical faith, which seems to be a pretty big part of his whole philosophy.
Absolutely. It's a complex idea with a few layers to it. First, it's the belief that real philosophy has to be grounded in a faith in the transcendence of human existence. Second, it insists that this faith can't abandon reason. You can't just rely on dogma or blind belief. Faith has to be intellectually honest. And third, it recognizes that the evidence for faith will always be kind of paradoxical, uncertain. It requires us to keep an open mind and keep searching. It's not about having all the answers, but about the constant search, the ongoing conversation about transcendence, while recognizing that we'll never know everything. He saw as this crucial balance between, theology and anthropology, this way to avoid dogmatism on either side.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. It's a really intricate and fascinating system of thought. So given all this, why do you think Jaspers is sometimes seen as a bit of an outsider in philosophy today?
Well, the Stanford entry points out a few things. First, unlike some of his contemporaries, Jaspers didn't create a specific school of thought, with followers who went out and spread his ideas. He was more about philosophy as a personal journey than about building a rigid system. Second, some of the big names in 20th century German philosophy, guys like Heidegger, Lukács, and Adorno, they weren't big fans of his work. They criticized him, and that probably had an impact on how he was received. And then there's the issue of translations. Some of the English translations of his work haven't been great, and that's made it harder for English-speaking audiences to really get into his ideas.
Yeah, bad translations can really hurt a philosopher's reputation. Anything else?
Some people argue that his focus on metaphysics and what some might see as kind of a speculative style of philosophy didn't really fit with the trends in Anglo-American philosophy, which leaned more towards, analytical and empirical approaches. And then there's the fact that he was associated with, well, kind of less exciting times in German history than some of his peers. Maybe that made him seem less, I don't know, less dramatic or something.
So combination of factors then, no dedicated school, some criticism from influential figures, translation issues, and maybe even just bad timing. But the entry does mention that there's been some renewed interest in his work lately.
Yeah, there are definitely signs of that. People are starting to look at his work with fresh eyes, appreciating his insights into, the limits of knowledge, the nature of human existence, and the relationship between reason and transcendence. His ideas are still relevant today.
All right, good to hear. Now, before we wrap up, let's touch on his political thought. He was pretty involved in post-war Germany.
Oh, absolutely. He's a major public intellectual in the rebuilding of Germany after the Nazi era. He wrote a lot about what kind of government was needed for a just society, and he was a big proponent of moral democratic education. And his analysis of totalitarianism was really powerful. He saw it as like the destruction of political humanity, this triumph of purely instrumental rationality over ethics.
And what did his own political philosophy look like?
He put a lot of emphasis on cultural tradition, but like a living tradition,
Yes, yeah.
And he believed in free and open communication between citizens. He saw a role for some technocratic planning, but within limits. He thought we needed a strong constitution to protect rights and freedoms. And he believed in the importance of what he called reasonable persons, people who were both intellectually and morally capable.
Yeah.
Now, it's worth noting that he wasn't a fan of pure democracy. He thought it had its problems. And his whole political philosophy, while it's very humanistic, it does feel a bit old-fashioned, kind of rooted in those earlier liberal traditions.
So, a philosopher who was deeply engaged with the political issues of his time, even if his solutions were sometimes inspired by an earlier era.
That's a good way to put it. He saw the terrible things that happen when power goes unchecked,
Yeah.
the way human dignity is crushed under totalitarianism.
Mm.
And his political philosophy was his attempt to create a more just and humane society after all that.
Well, this has been a really insightful journey into the world of Karl Jaspers. We've covered his path from psychiatry to philosophy, the thinkers who influenced him, his key ideas on limits, transcendence, and philosophical faith. We've talked about why he's not always as well known as maybe he should be, and we even touched on his political thought. For all of you philosophers out there listening, I think it's clear that Jaspers has a lot to offer. He gives us a new way to think about the limits of knowledge, the nature of being human, and the whole idea of transcendence.
And I think his emphasis on foundering, on how recognizing our limitations can actually lead to a deeper understanding of transcendence, that raises some really interesting questions for how we approach philosophy today. So much of contemporary philosophy is about building these complex systems, but what if, like Jaspers suggests, real understanding comes from letting those systems fall apart? It's a thought-provoking idea, and it might even make you want to go back and check out some of Jaspers' work for yourself.
Definitely something to think about. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We appreciate you being here.